Facebook co-founder and economist Chris Hughes out with a new book this morning. It's called Marketcrafters, the 100-year struggle to shape the American economy. It explores the history of capitalism. He joins us now. Got a whole bunch of things to talk to you about. But
I'm ready.
But maybe the best way to start is to try to put this moment in terms of our politics and maybe our economy in the context of what you looked at, because you talk about sort of the whole sweep of history and, by the way, Democrats ruling and Republicans ruling.
Absolutely. So this book makes the case that there's a long history of policymakers organizing and managing markets for political goals, things like making Americans richer, safer, more economically stable. That's a joint project. Republicans do it, Democrats do it, and only by uncovering that hidden history are we going to figure out some way to rebuild after the chaos of Trump in this moment.
Okay, so here's my question. How important is, you went to Harvard, for example.
I did.
How important do you think government spending as it relates to universities, science endeavors, and things like that, compared to the quote-unquote true private market where there's no government money at all?
It's incredibly important. I mean, the universities are a major engine of research and development, and as you've seen over the past half century, the overall public investment in R&D has gone down, and a lot of that has shifted to the universities as being the engines of doing that. Now, for me, at least in the context of my research, what I find is even more powerful is when government institutions are doing that kind of R&D, making those kinds of investments for political goals. So something like the CHIPS Act from a few years ago, Republicans started in the first Trump administration. Republicans believed we needed to make semiconductors here. The Biden folks agreed. Congress passes it. Now we have 5 of the world's largest semiconductor fabricators either operating or opening plants here. That's a major investment of R&D, of course, but also of industrial policy to make us safer, and it's successful, and we can learn a lot from it.
There's been a lot of criticism about tariffs, but is there any example that, I mean, you talk a lot about more, I would say, carrots than sticks, if you will,
fair.
But are there any examples where the stick has worked?
Well, I think on balance, the public investment industrial policy is a much better way to accomplish these goals. So bringing back jobs in American manufacturing, for instance. I think targeted tariffs can work in some moments, but I definitely don't think that's what's happening in this
What do you make when we see a
administration?
press release like Roche announced this morning they're going to have make a $50 billion investment in the U.S. They say it's going to create 12,000 jobs over the next 5 years. Right? We saw NVIDIA make a statement last week. We saw Apple make a statement 2 months. Is that policy by press release, or is that real?
No, I think it can be real. However, I also think that if Trump fires Powell, then the chaos in those markets is going to lift the cost of borrowing. It's going to make it a lot harder to follow up on those kinds of promises. So I think I'm American, I'm a patriot. I believe that it would be great to have those kinds of investments here at home. I just think that there, in the long term, is a much better way to go about doing it.
One of the things I've been thinking about is, assuming that Powell is out next May anyway, and assuming that Trump is going to put his person in then, why would the market dislike his firing, but be fine with whoever replaces him? Because you're going to think that because of what it says.
Because of what it said. Because of what it said.
But the practical reality may be no different.
I don't think that's right. I think, a quarter of the book that I write about is the history of the Fed and why its insulation and independence is so important to its success. And so, first off, the Federal Reserve Act is very clear. The chair cannot be fired unless it's for cause. Now, the FTC Act also says that, and Trump has fired 2 of the Democratic commissioners. So we'll see if he follows the law in the first place. However, if he does fire the chair, he can also remove the other governors. So if he so chooses, if the courts uphold that way of thinking about it. And so all of a sudden you have a board of governors which is entirely dependent on the political cycle. And how are you going to trust that to guarantee price stability, let alone financial stability or full employment?
Chris, I just have almost my default position is that the government is probably the worst entity at you're snickering.
I'm not snickering. I just have a sense of what you're going to say.
It's the worst. No, it's just historically central planning and trying to allocate resources based on what 100 intellectuals in an administration think they should do. It just hasn't worked out in the past. And iPencil, Adam Smith, the invisible hand, that industrial, and I would say both sides probably make mistakes in terms of trying to orchestrate industrial policy. Solyndra on one side, you know, and then the Republicans do tariffs on the other side with all the unintended consequences of tariffs. It just seems like central planning and industrial policy never works.
Yeah. So I'm with you on central planning, but you like the Fed.
Is that different than industrial planning?
Well, what I'm talking about is something called Marketcraft. And so I think the Fed is a good example here. I imagine you like it. Most investors, watchers of the show believe that on balance, it's a good thing to have. The Fed is literally guiding short-term money markets, sets the price of credit, and then it buffers and ensures that in any given day it functions in an orderly fashion. That's not planning. Nor is that a free market fantasy. That's Marketcraft.
You think the government can decide which
and inspiring
but the Fed, not talking about the Fed, but let's talk about just innovation in the way that, you know, the way that the private sector decides to allocate resources for things. You don't think that's more effective than a bunch of smart people in Washington?
I wrote the book because I believe that the private sector is very, very important to spurring innovation.
No, that's what the whole book says.
Managed and
it's all about entrepreneurs more than
it's a dance. You need two. You need the state and you need markets to make it work.
But it was just that the government industrial policy has been more important than the private sector in terms of innovation.
I think this is a false choice. More important or less important. You need both of these things to guide markets and make sure that they're working the way that we want them to. You need it on climate policy. I think, you know, the Biden administration is a perfect example of between the beginning and the end. Let me just finish.
Okay.
Where climate investment doubled because of the IRA, because we agreed, hey, climate's actually a big problem, guys, and we need to attract
he doesn't agree with that.
We don't agree with that.
He doesn't agree with that.
I think that's a prime example of what I'm talking about.
Well, we agree on some things and we disagree on others. But I think the important thing is seeing that Marketcraft is a real history that we need to wrestle with and reckon with if we're going to be able to think about these things constructively in the future.
Well, I just want to go back to then the tariff piece, because I would argue the tariff piece is similar to, you know, the carrot piece or the CHIPS Act.
That's what I'm saying. And both sides use industrial policy, and it seems to be ineffective on both sides. I mean, the CHIPS Act gave, you know, they picked Intel as one. I mean, they do have fab plants, obviously, but they picked the biggest.
But this goes back to the question whether then you're very happy they're taking money away from Harvard. My point is, like, this is picking and choosing thing is the problem.
I'm saying with $37 trillion in debt, that we've had 30 times the amount of funding just in the last 20 years or whatever.
Right, and what I've said, if you want to defund universities, we should have a debate about that. If you want to defund specific universities, we should have a different conversation about that, because that's where it gets more complicated.
But I think the key thing that I'm trying to say is that it's not just about industrial policy. You look back at Treasury Secretary Bill Simon, the libertarian's libertarian.
Right.
When he was in government in the 1970s, he worked with Alan Greenspan to set up the Strategic Petroleum Reserve to take enormous amounts of oil, store them here so that we would be able to be resilient if there was another oil embargo, and so that we could buffer the price. I don't think you would call that industrial policy. I wouldn't either, but it is Marketcraft. It's saying that we can't just wait for energy markets to supply us. We need government to have a guiding hand here to make sure these things are stable, and we haven't had an energy crisis in 40-plus years because of it.
Then your guys, I'm talking about Biden, used it because the emergency was that prices were too high during the midterms. So we depleted it to where we're down how much at this point?
The SPR.
Yeah.
The SPR still has hundreds of billions.
Right, but we're probably 40%. Aren't we down 40%?
Well, the whole idea is to use it to buffer. Like, if you're not using it,
you said for wars. You didn't say for higher energy prices.
No, I didn't say for wars. No, actually for price buffering. I think it's important.
That wasn't an emergency, the midterms.
What I think is important to learn from the SPR is that we can buffer prices, right? So that when they get high, we can ensure that they don't get too expensive. And when they go low, we can ensure that they're... Exactly, and that is Marketcraft.
It is fossil fuels, though, Chris.
Well, it is. We need them, it turns out.